Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Najmi Bin Nazaruddin. My student ID is 2020481916. I'm from EC110-4N. So now I'm going to compile a video about mini project ECG263 for 5 tests, which is water content test, particle density test, particle size grading and texture test, and also field density test, and lastly a test about permeability. The first test is water content. The objective of this test is to determine the water content of soil sample. So this is the apparatus that I use in this test, a mechanical balance and then 3 containers. For the procedure, firstly we will tear the balance so the reading is accurate, and then we will take the mass of tray, record the mass of tray with soil, and then we will dry the soil under sun for 4 hours, and lastly we will record the weight, the mass of dry soil. This is the data from tests. We can see M1, M2 and M3, and then the average water content from the calculation. Okay, so for the discussion of moisture content. Moisture content is a term that describes the amount of water in a soil sample. In this experiment, I sun-dry the soil sample for 4 hours, and to determine the moisture content, we will use the formula on the right screen. And lastly, I repeated 3 times of this test to get average result. Conclusion of water content test. The objective of the experiment is achieved, which is to determine the water content of my soil sample. The second test is particle density. The objective of this test is to determine the specific gravity of soil sample using density bottle. The apparatus of this test is a balance and 3 containers with a jug of water. For the procedure, I try to replicate the laboratory standard procedure. Firstly, we will record the mass of the container, and then mass of container with our soil sample, and then we will fill the container with water and make sure there is no bubble, and then we will record the mass of container with soil, with wet soil, and lastly we will record the mass of container with fully filled with water. This is the data for particle density. As we can see, we have M1, M2, M3 and M4, and we some calculation there to get the average particle density and also specific gravity of my soil sample. For the discussion, specific gravity is a ratio of density of a substance to standard substance. In my case, it's a ratio of density of soil sample with water. So in this experiment, I will dry the soil sample under sun for 4 hours, and to determine the specific gravity, we will use the formula provided on the right side of screen. And for accuracy's sake, I repeat the experiment 3 times and get average results. Conclusion. The objective of experiment is achieved, which is the specific gravity of the soil sample using corresponding formula in guidelines. The third test is particle size grading and texture. The objective of this test is to determine the percentage of different grain sizes contained within a soil sample. So So this is my apparatus, a 3 sieving set with different sizes. For the procedure of particle size grading and texture, firstly, I chose dry sieving method for my experiment, for my test. Then I take a soil sample and dry it under sun for 4 hours. After that, I run the sun through different sizes of sieve, and then I recorded every sieve with the retained soil and tabulate the data. This is the data for particle size, grading and texture. So the initial mass of dry soil is 681 gram, and the soil passing 6 mm is around 5 gram. For the discussion of particle size grading, there are two methods available, which is wet sieving and dry sieving, and as I mentioned earlier, I choose the dry sieving method. Before the sieving can start, the soil sample is dried under the sun for 4 hours, and to determine the grain size percentages, we will calculate and then put it in a chart. The conclusion for particle size grading, the objective of experiment is achieved, which is to obtain the percentages of various soil size from my soil sample. The fourth experiment is field density. The objective of this experiment is to obtain dry density and bulk density of soil in situ soil. This is the apparatus for field density. There is a scale, a balance, a container, and 3 cylinder container, 1 hammer, and some shovel for excavating works. The procedure for field density. So firstly, we will obtain 3 in situ soil sample using the cylinder container, and then we will record the mass of container with soil to obtain the weight of soil, and then we will dry the soil sample that we have obtained, and then we will compare with the mass of wet soil. So for the data of field density, we have steel container dimensions, the diameter, the heights and the volume, and then we have WS, weight of steel container, WB, weight of steel container with bulk soil, and after some calculation, we have weight of bulk soil and then bulk density. For the discussion, the preparation of soil is a bit complex, as we need to take the soil sample directly from the site, or we call it in situ. The excavating work is quite tricky. And next, the soil sample is dried under the sun for 4 hours, and then to measure the achieved dry density and bulk density, there is formula provided at the right side of the screen. And then for the accuracy, I repeated the test 3 times to get average results. Conclusion for field density, the objective of experiment is achieved, which is to obtain the dry density and bulk density value of soil sample, or as we call it, in situ soil sample. The last experiment is permeability. The objective of this test is to obtain the coefficient of permeability of my soil sample. This is the apparatus for permeability test. I made this to replicate the apparatus in laboratory, which is a cylinder container with drainage holes at the bottom. For permeability test procedure, firstly we will acquire soil sample from site. The soil sample is not to be disturbed, or as we call it, in undisturbed condition, and then we will prepare the cylinder container with drainage at the bottom. And next step is fill the container with soil sample, and then mark the line of H1, H2, H3 until H4 at the cylinder container. And lastly, we will fill the cylinder container with water, and we will take the time interval between line H1 until H4 for the water to run out through the drainage. For permeability test data, we have the dimensions of sample, the diameter, length and area, and then we have the height of H1, H2, H3 and H4, and then we have times interval between H1 to H4, and lastly a simple calculation using formula to get coefficient of permeability and average coefficient of permeability of the soil sample. For the discussion of permeability test, firstly the preparation for soil sample is very simple, as it need to be in undisturbed condition. Secondly, to determine the coefficient of permeability, there is a formula attached. And lastly, I repeated 3 times the procedure to get average result and higher accuracy. For conclusion of permeability test, the objective of experiment is achieved, which is to obtain the coefficient of permeability from the soil sample. In my opinion, as a student, there are many advantages of mini project ECG263. So here I have listed 3 advantages. Firstly, it will increase student knowledge from various aspects. So as we know, students usually learn from lecturers and slides and notes that prepared, but now when we have a mini project like this, we will do more research and obtain more new informations from various sources. So the second advantages is increase source type on the internet. What I mean by source type is forms of information on the internet. So for example, some students never obtain informations rather than in video form, and some students only obtain informations in article form. So when students have mini project like this, they will have no choice but to obtain more information from many type of academic form on the internet. So last but not least, the advantages is to encourage deeper understanding of soil characteristic. To elaborate this point, when students doing research, they will of course came by with informations of higher level of education, such as informations from degree level or master level. So bit by bit, student will have deeper understanding rather than just understanding the syllabus or the information from classes. So that's all from me for mini project ECG263. Prepare for Madam Farah, Wahida, Latib. Thank you.